You give me the go.
Can we start?
We're good to go? Great. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're connected from. And delighted to open this first thematic session of the 2021 Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum of the OECD that will be devoted to the discussion on urban transport and city design. My name is Aziza AKHMOUCH. I'm heading at the OECD the division that works on cities, urban policy, and sustainable development, and I will be your moderator today for the session. You may be used by now, in particular if you attended the first plenary session, but I would just like for some background to share with you housekeeping arrangements in particular, and that's the most important, to let you know that the session is being recorded and will be made available on the OECD webpage, and also to invite you speakers and also from the audience to use either French or English when you ask your questions or when you make your interventions. We have the luck to have the interpretation in the 2 official languages of the OECD today, so let's make good use of this. Also, a word to invite you all to be active throughout the session on social media, but also using the Q&A function to ask questions, to signal the guest speakers that you are targeting, if they're targeted to any of the speakers, and we'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A throughout this hour and a half and make sure we have some leeway in between interventions and in a dedicated Q&A session at the end to address them. As I said, it's really my pleasure to open this conversation on a very important topic, the combination of the urban transport, clean forms of urban mobility discussion, and that of city design. Those of you that participated in the earlier session heard a lot about how cities are important to build back or build forward better, heard a lot about the extent to which this pandemic, as many crises in the past, have really opened avenues for a new normal in terms of how we live in our cities, how we work in our cities, how we move in our cities. We've seen a number of paradigm shifts that make us think that on a number of issues there will be no return to normal, or renewed relationship to proximity, or renewed expectations about environmental awareness, local loops, everything we've heard about reducing CO2 emissions and many of the agglomeration costs that we know many of our cities across the globe are suffering from, in particular large cities. And it will really be a pleasure today to hear from some of the thinkers and doers around this topic and the latest developments that we have observed in OECD countries in particular. We will basically look at 3 main areas in this session. The first one is really to try to understand the role that urban planning is playing in reducing air pollution, in mitigating climate change, and in promoting people's well-being at large. The second one is to try to understand the impact of this pandemic and the implications for mass transit and shared and soft mobility in this new normal. And it was said earlier that today in Paris there's a lengthy conversation going about a cycling plan that the city is putting forward, and we'll see how this window makes a number of these environmental solutions probably slightly more acceptable than they were just 2 or 3 years ago. And the third one is really to look at the public space allocation in cities, and in particular how some of the concepts that have gained a lot of traction recently, and we have the architect of one of them with us in the panel, such as the 15-minute city, are holding really implications for the rethinking of our urban settings. We will have a twofold sequence for this panel. So we'll have first a keynote speaker that will set the scene, and my pleasure to welcome Karen VANCLUYSEN, Kapos. Karen was appointed Secretary General of POLIS in September 2014 after having been the network's research director for about 8 years. Since 1998, she's been involved in urban mobility networking, innovation and policy activities, as well as a wide range of European urban transport research projects. Karen will share with her the wisdom that POLIS has developed on this rethinking of urban transport. And then we'll get into a panel discussion, and I'll just introduce them very briefly as a teaser. We'll have with us the mayor of Haifa in Israel, Einat KALISCH-ROTEM, who also happens to be a member of the OECD Champion Mayors for Inclusive Growth. We'll have with us Carlos Moreno, the architect, as I said, of the 15-minute city concept and associate professor at the Sorbonne University. We will also have with us Areli CARREON, who's activist and bicycle mayor, a very interesting position in Mexico City. And close to me in this room, my colleague Walid OUESLATI, who's senior economist in the Environment Directorate. Panelists will have a good 4 minutes each. We'll do 2 rounds and we'll take some questions in between. So please do the best possible use of the Q&A. Karen, maybe over to you. I understand you have a PowerPoint presentation for a 10, 12 minute scene setting. You have the floor. And if you could say maybe a bit of background on POLIS itself. I introduced you, but your organization and what you've been doing these days, drawing lessons from this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Aziza, and thank you very much for inviting me also to talk about a topic that is really close to my heart and is also very close to the activities indeed of the POLIS network, which is a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and innovation. We bring together around 100 cities and regions from all over Europe. And obviously, respacing the streets, rebuilding the backbone, and rethinking urban mobility is very high on our agenda. And that's what I will be talking about to set the scene in this particular session. So when we look at urban mobility in our cities, we see that our cities are shaping policies which are very much centered around a number of challenges that they have been facing for a while now in the urban environment in relation to transport. And that is obviously climate change, but also air pollution, congestion, and road safety. And their policies focus on decarbonization, improving air quality, a modal shift away from the private car, which requires a tremendous behavioral change, and better protecting our vulnerable road users. On top of all these challenges and policy goals, then came COVID-19, which has been a very disruptive experience as well for the transport sector. And the question that we have before us today is whether we will go from lockdown to gridlock and how we can avoid that from happening, because we've seen that there are a number of threats indeed that this crisis has brought along also in the transport sector, but also, as mentioned before, a couple of opportunities that we should capitalize on if we are proactive. On the one hand, there is indeed a tremendous collapse of public transport, and the fact that it hasn't clearly recovered yet, and that we see at the same time that car traffic is rising again, and that people start to see the car as a kind of safety bubble, which obviously it is not. On the other hand, we've seen opportunities in terms of redistributed space in cities, an active travel boom, as was mentioned earlier, what it feels like to breathe clean air and to not have congestion in our city streets. And obviously, there will also be a legacy when it comes to working from home beyond this pandemic, which also has an impact on travel patterns. At the same time, while public transport has been suffering, I also want to highlight that it has kept on running and providing services for those who needed it at the peak of the lockdown and amidst the pandemic, which I think is at the same time an excellent example of what public service should be like. Then I believe that we really are in front of a unique momentum and crossroads that we should really grab. What behavioral experts always tell us is that people are open to changing deeply rooted habitual behavior, such as mobility behavior, when there is a life-changing moment. And I do believe that COVID-19 could be such a life-changing moment where they temporarily change their travel habits, and maybe we can make sure they now make those changes permanent, at least those that are more sustainable than they used to be. At the same time, we've been offered a huge sandbox to play in, because we know that a very powerful way to win the hearts and minds of people is to let them experience and trial out measures in real life. And that's what we've been doing by introducing temporary measures that people could also at the same time feel what it feels like, and maybe be more open to making those measures permanent in the future. So that way, we really have a unique opportunity to work towards this integrated, multimodal, sustainable urban mobility ecosystem that many of us are dreaming of. So coming back to what has actually happened throughout the past year and a half, we've seen a massive respacing of our city streets through residential zones, for example, in Brussels, prioritizing pedestrians and cyclists, reducing speed limits, streets being converted into cycling streets, sidewalks being widened so that pedestrians had more space, pop-up bike lanes being introduced, bicycle lanes and routes being rolled out faster than initially planned, etc. So those are all very encouraging signs, I would say. Also, the very sensitive issue of repurposing parking spaces was done by giving those parking spaces to increased room for terraces, for example, for restaurants and bars that people could allow people to meet outside, or additional playing areas, colorful areas, as you can see here in Lisbon, which is the Street is Yours initiative. Also, when we are asking city dwellers whether they agree that cities must take action to curb air pollution, in this case, by reserving more public space for sustainable modes, we see that actually quite a large majority is strongly agreeing, or at least somewhat agreeing, that this is indeed needed and that this is the right way to move forward. Then looking at where we are today, we see that through the cycling measures tracker of the European Cyclist Federation, that while there is a discrepancy between the kilometers of infrastructure measures announced and the ones implemented, still it's a very encouraging graph which is showing that actually quite a lot of the announced measures have been rolled out. And then we're talking about cycle lanes, but also traffic calming measures, introducing car-free areas in the city center, and widened pavements, as mentioned before. So it is going in the right direction, and we see that progressively cities are introducing and have been introducing these measures in favor of more space for active travel and sustainable modes in general. There's been some initial studies as well, which show that the increase in infrastructure for those modes has also led in increased cycling numbers, for example, an increase between 11 and 48% in the cities that were studied in this particular study from the Mercator Research Institute, which, if they become permanent, would really lead to significant benefits over time, including health benefits linked to cycling. So these are encouraging numbers. We see that those cities where the chances of those measures becoming permanent over time are the highest are also cities which have very good sustainable urban mobility plans in place, meaning that they already had a long-term vision in terms of how they wanted to reshape and respace their cities, and that what is actually done right now is accelerate measures that were already in the pipeline or were planned for the years to come. So we see also that cities can be very agile and flexible as well when under pressure, and can become very fast in terms of action when it is really urgently needed. And that gives us hope in terms of those measures staying in place as well. What is very important when we talk about these different measures is that the city is actually in charge of a very powerful tool, and that is urban space, and is more and more becoming of an urban space manager, because by taking space away from certain modes or giving space additionally to other modes, they really can decide which sustainable mobility modes they want to prioritize in their urban environments. And there are different types of interventions in that respect, ranging from putting a price on space up to reallocating space and different types of land use planning approaches. And increasingly, we also see that cities are trying to move towards a dynamic management of urban space, where the function of urban space can also differ according to the needs of the day and the moments in time. And this is also an interesting study that was conducted by the International Transport Forum, specifically on dynamic curbside management. Obviously, all these types of interventions really are enablers as well for the 15-minute city approach. As was mentioned, this is gaining ground, and I will not be talking about it in detail, obviously, because we have the father of the 15-minute city in the panel following this presentation. But it really is something that is picking up and taking off in cities such as Paris, for example. When we then look at the other side of the coin and where we are today in terms of public transport ridership, we see that public transport has not recovered just yet. Many are around between 60 and 70% of the ridership compared to pre-pandemic levels. So there is still work to be done. At the same time, there is no choice but to make sure that we rebuild that backbone. And I do believe that there is at the same time a momentum right now in terms of redefining what public transport actually is and joining forces with modes that can complement public transport and can become part of that public transport family. Because basically when we look at mass transit and what it brings us, there is no alternative, which is as efficient, equitable, accessible, and affordable. So it's really needed for our cities to remain livable and to tackle the multiple other transport-related crises that I was mentioning before and that haven't gone anywhere during COVID-19, unfortunately. So what we need to do is really embrace a mix of mass transit and shared mobility, including active travel through shared mobility, and make that part of the public transport family. This will require new types of public-private partnerships, new types of cooperation, even new business models, and we even have to consider also subsidizing some of those schemes, or at least part of those trips, if they indeed help cities to reach their public policy goals and reach their equity goals as well, for example, in the field of mobility provision. That way, by bringing these different options together in an integrated picture and also by favoring multimodality and intermodality, we can really offer a wide range of options that together can really be a valuable alternative to what is still perceived as being the freedom of the private car, which is in the end not the freedom of others because it's unsustainable over time. So there are a number of encouraging examples that I would like to briefly quote in terms of bringing those different options together. We see, for example, that the Swiss railways are offering hubs at stations where micromobility is being offered, but also are integrating these micromobility options to cover the first and last urban mile in their own public transport app. So there are definitely a number of encouraging examples which show us that this integration is happening on the ground. And we need physical integration through mobility hubs, through interchanges where the different modes come together, but also digital integration through mobility as a service to make sure that also people can combine in a digital way these different types of modes. But when it comes down to a radical change in our cities, we cannot do it only with carrots and we cannot only do it with incentives. We will also have to make sure that the polluter pays and that we internalize the external costs related to unsustainable travel options in society. That's why increasingly we also see that cities are introducing low emission zones, ultra low emission zones, and are moving towards zero emission zones. They're introducing congestion charging, intelligent kilometer charging. They're banning through traffic in city centers. Very sensitive measures in terms of political accountability, but at the same time, necessary measures, and those that do it really show political leadership in that respect. Because unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, no one miracle solution that will help us to transform transportation. So we really need this combination of carrots and sticks in moving forward. And if we do indeed capitalize on the momentum we have in front of us and dare to take bold measures and make temporary measures permanent on top of that, I do believe that our cities can bounce back in a good way from the current crisis and become more resilient and robust in the future, also from a mobility perspective. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karen VANCLUYSEN, Secretary General of Police. Extremely interesting presentation. Some takeaways I gather from your presentation in terms of the why this transition is needed, what type of transition you're calling for, and how this could be done. In the why, I think we've really learned a lot about the connection with public space. It's true that the discourse around reducing individual cars in large metropolitan areas is often associated with the environmental externalities that there they're generating, and in particular the air pollution. But you have reminded us that this is also a public space issue. We know that a car on average in a city is stalled 80% of the time, but 50% of the urban space is closely or directly or indirectly related to cars. And I think that spatial justice that you emphasized and this trend of reclaiming public space, which we hear more and more in this right to the city movement, is a very good point. In terms of the what, reminding that cycling is part of the solution, but not the only solution. And indeed, you've stressed to which extent, and that's something we are also advocating for at the OECD. We need a mix of different forms of mobility that are balanced, and reminding us the importance of public transportation in particular. And we know the business model of public transports is at stake in this post-pandemic period because of the anxiety that physical distanciation is still having for many of the urban dwellers. And on the how, the combination of the stick and the carrot and some of the economic instruments you've showcased that help not only collect revenues but also change behaviors, and that's all about changing our individual behaviors as well. So thank you very much, Karen, and stay with us. We'll get into the panel now, but from time to time I'll pick your brain on some of the questions that may be asked. And let me now turn to our four guests, and I thank you all for being with us and for your time today. I will switch to French to introduce our colleague and my friend Carlos Moreno. Carlos, bonjour. Je le disais tout à l'heure, vous êtes l'architecte de la ville du quart d'heure, et on reviendra dans un instant sur la ville du quart d'heure en tant que telle, mais c'est vrai qu'en discutant avec vous récemment, on a aussi échangé sur les leçons de la COP26 et notamment cet appel, cette injonction d'accélérer cette transition écologique dans les villes, puisque c'est là où la plupart des gens vivent et travaillent, et on sait le transport, la mobilité et les nouvelles formes de proximité que vous appelez de vos voeux ont un rôle très important à jouer. Est-ce que vous pouvez peut-être, dans un premier temps, en restant sur cette question de l'espace public et de la révolution des proximités, partager votre pensée et le rôle de la décarbonation des transports dans ce nouveau paradigme?
Bien sûr, chère Aziza, merci beaucoup pour cette aimable invitation. Et je salue les personnes qui sont connectées. Je les salue de Barcelone, où justement la communauté internationale se donne rendez-vous dans 3 jours. Je viens de sortir d'une table ronde justement sur les liens entre la mobilité et l'espace public, qui est tout à fait la question qui est posée. Et je dirais, comme j'ai pu le dire ce matin ici à Barcelone, que ma première réflexion à vous partager sur le fait que l'espace public aujourd'hui, c'est la clé pour nos villes, pour retrouver la démocratie, pour retrouver du brassage, pour retrouver de la mixité sociale, pour trouver des lieux dans lesquels on puisse revendiquer l'égalité des genres également. Mais l'espace public, pour qu'il joue ce rôle de lien social qui est également extrêmement important. Ça doit être donc un espace public à haute qualité de vie humaine, et pour cela, il faut le libérer au maximum de tout ce qui empêche que ce lien social, ce lien humain puisse avoir lieu. Et c'est pour ça que quand je évoque cette notion de proximité heureuse, j'ai dit que les hommes, les femmes, les personnes âgées, les jeunes ont droit, toutes et tous, à un espace public qui soit pour vivre et non pas uniquement pour voir passer des voitures à longueur de journée, qui en plus, avec la problématique des CO2, des pollutions, des particules fines, complexifie un problème en dégradant la qualité de vie. Je ne suis pas dans une dynamique dans laquelle on oppose les voitures par rapport à l'espace public. J'ai dit tout simplement que dans les villes, en fonction de la densité, en fonction de la concentration, donc les hypercentres, les lieux à haute densité, les lieux à moyenne et haute densité, il faut que cet espace public, effectivement, permette de créer une triple activité. Une activité écologique, bien sûr, avec une décarbonation importante et libérée par rapport à la santé, l'air de particules fines, mais il faut qu'elle joue aussi un rôle par rapport à l'économie. Il faut que ce soit des lieux dans lesquels l'économie puisse permettre l'émergence de nouveaux modèles, de nouvelles activités, des commerces locaux, réindustrialisés. Et pour cela, effectivement, on a besoin d'essayer le retour entre l'espace public et les espaces privés, mais dans le sens de la convivialité. Et le troisième élément, il faut que ce soit un lieu d'inclusion sociale pour ceux qu'on a du mal aujourd'hui à se finir par les bien vivre ensemble. Mais dans une période où on voit le racisme, la démagogie, le populisme s'installer dans nos vies, dans nos villes et nos villes, notamment aussi avec une technologie qui crée des bulles et dans lesquelles chaque individu vit dans ces bulles, plus que jamais, ces espaces de brassage sont absolument indispensables. L'espace public a un sens s'il contribue donc à améliorer cette mixité. Mais cette mixité, je considère qu'elle doit être donc la clé de voûte de ces proximités heureuses, c'est-à-dire des lieux dans lesquels l'espace public également vient côtoyer, des lieux dans lesquels on va trouver des activités de travail, des activités de commerce, des activités qui ont lieu à la santé, des activités sportives, des activités culturelles. Je considère, et on en parlera peut-être tout à l'heure, que les proximités aujourd'hui, c'est l'enjeu majeur dans nos villes, dans les années et dans les décennies qui viennent. Et que donc le transport public est en fait un corollaire de la présence ou de l'absence d'une socialisation intense. Le Covid-19 nous a montré que plus que jamais, cette proximité a besoin d'intensité sociale. Le Covid-19 nous a montré que nous devons donc créer cette espèce de nouveau tissu social dans lequel on puisse se retrouver les uns et les autres, mais que l'économie va de pair également avec l'écologie, puisque nous ne pourrons pas avoir la génération de valeur et les répartitions de la richesse si nous n'arrivons pas à installer des activités productives. Donc, je préconise et je me bats pour un espace public donc, de partage, pour un espace public qui irrigue la ville également de services, et pour un espace public dans lequel l'ensemble des proximités permet de nous faire accéder à de nouvelles ressources que parfois nous ignorons et que nous allons très loin les chercher, quand en fait ils sont juste à côté de nous, il faut les découvrir, il faut les apprivoiser, et c'est pour cela qu'il faut des politiques urbaines assez ambitieuses qui permettent de capter la richesse de la proximité que souvent nous ignorons.
Merci beaucoup, Carlos Moreno, professeur associé au sein de la chaire Entreprise, Territoire et Innovation de la Sorbonne à l'IAE et architecte du concept de la ville du quart d'heure. Je crois que j'entends dans vos propos, Carlos, que l'accessibilité et la mobilité ne sont pas antinomiques. C'est vrai qu'on a tendance à opposer les deux en disant qu'on passe d'une logique de mobilité à une logique d'accessibilité, mais qu'il faut de la mobilité au sein de cette proximité heureuse que vous décrivez, et notamment les aspirations économiques, sociales et environnementales qui vont avec. On reviendra vers vous, cher Carlos, sur la ville du quart d'heure en particulier et son application jusqu'à ce jour. And it's my pleasure now to turn to our second guest. And thank you very much, Mayor, for being with us. Mayor Einat KALISCH-ROTEM from Haifa in Israel. You've been very vocal within the Champion Mayors initiative and beyond about the massive efforts that you've engaged to rethink the built environment in order to curb urban sprawl and minimize some of the pressure on land. And we know in Israel you are facing a lot of pressure on land and land use, and to preserve biodiversity. If you can share with us some of the initiatives you've taken to drive this urban renewal agenda and how you've been engaging the different stakeholders, because the work we've been doing on land use and housing at the OECD shows that sometimes, you know, property developers, building owners are massive, let's say, resistance to changes such as the conversion of buildings into other purposes and so on. And I think you've built this coalition with the public-private sector that was instrumental in this urban regeneration agenda. Mayor, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This is very exciting and very happy to be here. For the last 3 years, we are working on many urban renewal plans, around 40 plans that are focusing on quite old neighborhoods and very places that we need to rethink the infrastructure. There was a high pressure in Haifa, as we have in all Israel, to build new neighborhoods, to build new places. I received a few new plans that I tried to stop. This is not very easy. And to push or to move the energies into the places that need renewal. We also changed the mindset of planning and the development. No more zoning plans. We are focusing on multi-use landscape or multi-use purposes, uses. We are focusing on the implementation or the combination of transportation within the neighborhoods, of places for work to be scattered along or around the neighborhoods. I would like to see less cars in the city. We are also rethinking about infrastructure, such as the natural infrastructure of Haifa. Haifa is a very beautiful city located on the mountain of the Carmel Mountain, with many wadis and greenery. We are doing everything in our power to maintain the greenery and renew the existing and the built surroundings. Also, putting all our energies in urban streets, in walkable streets, in the walkability planning, in diminishing or reducing how do I say that, the distances between the urban residential places and the commercial places. And we changed the policy of small businesses and the livable streets. So there were many small projects that we did, especially during the pandemic, in order to revive the streets and the commercial streets and reduce the need to use transportation and as much as possible help people want to walk to all the places around. This is not very easy because Haifa is located on the mountain, and sometimes in various places it's quite difficult to move about. But we managed in various places, and we see more and more people in the streets. So that was more or less our effort in the last 3 years. I have to say we started before the pandemic began, and we accelerated our work as much as possible in the last 2 years.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And I think we hear from you, and that echoes what Karen was saying earlier, to which extent this pandemic was a sort of trend accelerator, and that some of the initiatives that were in the pipeline maybe gained momentum and traction. Fascinating to hear how you are trying to go beyond these zero-sum logics and managing some of these difficult trade-offs in land use. It's not only about urban development or energy or agriculture, and probably finding ways to transform different motivations into complementary ones, and using multi-purpose infrastructure, including green, low-cost, nature-based solutions to that effect is interesting, and positioning the city, you know, as sometimes a promoter, sometimes a facilitator, sometimes an enabler. We can see the myriad of actions you've taken, and I can see there are already some questions coming our way. So an opportunity to remind the close to 200 participants online to ask your questions via the Q&A function. We'll take some maybe before the second round of the panel. And now let me turn to our third speaker from Mexico. Glad to introduce Areli CARREON. As I said, Areli, you have this nice mandate of bicycle mayor. Maybe you can tell us a bit more on what this is and means concretely. But one thing I know in the past conversations we had is that as an environmental activist, you have really made a very strong case for those clean forms of urban mobility, and we know they require a cultural shift, we know they require political commitment, but you have put special emphasis in documenting some of the direct benefits that come from that transition, including quantifying some of them. There were a few benefits related to health that were showcased by Karen earlier from POLIS standpoint, but also documenting the costs of not adopting those solutions. And for us as OECD, you know, we are evidence-based. We influence policy and decision-making based on facts and data. So this is a very interesting approach. Can you tell us a bit more on these benefits and these costs that have come out of your research and recent publications, and why you think the revolution of cycling is still so slow despite awareness on those benefits and costs?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And yes, I am an activist on cycling. And as a bicycle mayor, which was a position created for an Netherlands NGOs, and we are more than 100 activists around the world creating momentum and synergies for the advancement of cycling around the world. And yes, we've seen, as my prior speakers said, great momentum created for cycling around the world because of COVID. We've been for decades worked to transform the way we move in the cities, both to reduce pollutant emissions that account for nearly a third of GEA emissions globally, as well as to save the life of more than 1 million people that die or lose their health in perfectly preventable road crashes each year globally. So we have this consensus among NGOs, scientists, and policy multidisciplinary working groups, as well as international bodies, about the urgency of transforming our mobility paradigm from moving vehicles to move people. And through the void, shift, and improve approach, manage to provide access for all. And the 15-minute cities is now a part of this big conversation on changing the mindset. And we already know what works and what needs to be done. As you were saying, in Mexico, because of the COVID pandemic, Mexico City, as well as other Mexican authorities like in San Pedro, Puebla, and Zapopan, they created emergency pop-up bike lanes in order to reduce the demand on the public transportation system. And this took nearly 2 weeks of planning, 3 days to set it up in place. And the result of this very fast and cheap infrastructure, or this decision, that it is needed to say that Mexico City's authorities managed to create these with recycled material that they already had. So this resulted in an immediate success for both public transit passengers. We managed to figure out that car users shifted from cars to bikes, and from BRT or public transportation to bikes. And also this was helped to improve trips of bike deliveries, also working to respond to the pandemic. And according to the authorities' accounts and also NGOs' independent measurements, this immediately resulted in a double of bike trips made in this avenue alone. So this success, as well with a campaign made with the NGOs' participation, has declared to be a permanent infrastructure in Mexico City in at least 28 kilometers that now are under construction. So this COVID pandemic created an exceptional moment to show the benefits and success of the active mobility. Also, it's needed to say that Mexican federal government created the Mobility 4S plan to promote safe, sustainable, healthy, and solidarian mobility in Mexico, along with rapid implementation guides and workshops. And for the first time in Mexican history, the bicycle became part of the urban conversation. At the end of 2020, the Safe Mobility Coalition, La Coalición Movilidad Segura, that gathers more than 70 Mexican organizations, achieved the constitutional recognition of mobility as a right in Mexico. But some of these impressive changes are now under siege. We are seeing the return of traffic congestion, high levels of pollution, political use of the anti-bicycle infrastructure sentiment, and even mob destruction in some Mexican cities. So, well, despite the fact that the bicycle is a real solution that is tackling not only mobility and pandemic issues, but also other issues other issues like physical and mental health, economic inclusion, economic reactivation, and equitable access for all, is not clear. It has been really torturous to see these changes. And as an activist and as part of this big activist community around the world, we are here to say this is a no-brainer. The cycling helps to achieve 11 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the cycling infrastructure is the queen of already available technologies for tackling climate change because it's low cost, it's quick, and has immediate positive results, and also positive results also in a large array of public benefits that are constantly overlooked, as the recovery of personal relationships, the strengthening of social tissue, the recovery of local identity and sense of belonging, an improvement of self-esteem along dwellers, like all these things that Carlos Moreno was saying, that it is very important for people to come together and be together and be able to live in the city, not only to transit it very rapidly. So investing in cycling mobility is safe, it's cost effective, has a very high return of nearly 19 times the amount that is invested in cycling, according to a study made of the World Bank made for Lima. And we, as part of the 300 organizations worldwide, just signed a letter to the COP26 chairs demanding the recognition of the bicycle as a truly zero-emission vehicle that deserves to be adopted as soon as possible. The bicycle is a fail-proof technology that is already here, is available for every country, is affordable for the vast majority of the population. So we just need to overcome our prejudice and invest in it. We need to have this conversation instead of being distracted in a car. So let's focus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Areli, and for taking us through the latest changes in Mexico City. I agree with you. Those of us who've been in Mexico City know this was not for granted, the enabling environment to make that transition. And I think what you've stressed about the agility of cities, and that's a presentation we also heard in the police intervention, through that tactical urbanism that maybe made a number of things way more possible at the least cost, also in terms of consultation during the pandemic, raises the question to the extent that they are going to be mainstreamed over the long term or not, these arrangements. We can come back to that during the Q&A, but we did see how the crisis was an opportunity to accelerate that wave and bicycle revolution. If you have information on those 100+ bicycle mayors, I'm sure participants in the session would be very interested. Feel free to share some links via the chat. And let me now turn to our last guest speaker, Walid OUESLATI, Senior Economist in the Environment Directorate at the OECD. Walid, you worked a lot on urban sprawl. You've documented some of the costs of urban sprawl in our cities in terms of service provision, in terms of air pollution and so on. Could you take us through some of your findings and some of the trends you see affecting further compact or sprawl cities in the future?
Thank you, Aziza. Hello, everyone. I would devote to talk first about urban sprawl, because sometimes this can engage a debate anti and pro-urban sprawl. Sometimes urban sprawl could be even welfare improving. But let's talk only about urban development. It's very simple. My first remark that urban development is a necessity. That will continue in the future. We know that we have population growth. We know there's a needs for houses, for infrastructure, for transport, for mobility, everything. However, we know also that urban shapes, the form or the morphology of cities, is very correlated to the mobility pattern and the transport pattern. So looking at this form and its evolution, it's an important aspect which can influence afterward on the design of the policies. But before talking about the policy, let's have just some ideas about urban development. City shapes, city forms matters for many aspects, for social aspect, for economic aspect, but also for environmental aspect, as we were talking about. And in the way how we looked at the city shape, it's important to have a multi-dimensional approach, that the city is not only a question of how we distribute the land uptake. What's the land uptake per capita, for instance? How many people consume space at the individual level? It goes behind that. This is what we call usually urban population density. So if we have low urban population density, you say you are in a sprawling situation. Yeah, but in the reality, the distribution of the population among the territory of the city, among the urban area, that's most important. Why? Because you will observe first that urban settlements are sometimes disconnected, are sometimes a kind of urban patch here and there, which cost a lot and mainly have an important impact on ecosystems and on biodiversity. That's very important aspect. Second, population around the territory of the city is not distributed in the same way. You have some district with very low population density, so the land uptake is very high, and some other, it's the opposite. So this situation, you can find it in different configuration around the world, around different cities. But which important, and I think this one aspect, because we are talking about the pandemic, and the pandemic is a global problem, that urban development for the future, in the future, will not have the same matters around the world. The most important driver of it is population growth, right? So, and population growth pressure will be more important in developing country and emerging country in the future. I'm talking under the control of Aziza. We know that the urban population in the coming 3 decades will nearly doubling, right? So imagine, that's a huge. So we are almost 50% of urban population around the world. So say that we are 7 billion, means that 3.5 billion are urban. Means tomorrow that we will have 7 billion urban population. Just imagine this impact. This impact will not be the same in New Delhi, in Paris, or in Auckland, or other city around the world. So that's very important. So let me first say that what we need to do is based on this multidimensional approach, let's observe the evolution, because that's what we need actually first, that we observe how the urban development is going around the world, around the cities. And with this observation that we can today, with satellite image and different information that we have, we can track the pathway. And then the action, and we provide very relevant information for planners at the city level that can help to design better policies.
Thank you very much, Walid OUESLATI, Senior Economist in the Environment Directorate, for reminding us the importance of urbanization for growth and the importance of quality urbanization for growth. We've seen indeed a number of countries where maybe the the costs of agglomeration have outweighed the benefits of agglomeration because the urbanization was of poor quality. And when judging the quality of urbanization, the question of mobility and transport is really at the core of this multidimensional criteria that you were flagging, and also for showing the diversity of situations. Indeed, we have 1 in 2 inhabitants, actually 48% according to the degree of urbanization that the OECD developed, living in cities today. 55% of people will be living in cities above 50,000 inhabitants by 2050. 70% if you take country-based definitions of what a city is, which we know varies a lot across countries. And so indeed, this is a mega trend that requires taking today a number of measures to address some of these agglomeration costs. We'll come back to what the OECD is recommending to design better cities and contain or curb to some extent this sprawl risk that we see is also a potential collateral effect of the pandemic, because what we are hearing now with the digital and teleworking revolution and the way this is affecting to some extent locational preferences of urban dwellers towards mid-sized cities that are close to large agglomeration areas may have also effects in terms of sprawl. If you take automated vehicles, this will probably have impacts on sprawl. So we'll come back to the recommendations. Maybe before we'll go the other way around, and I'll start with Walid with the second round of questions. I'll take 3 quick questions that I've seen in the chat and the Q&A, and I will start with you, Mayor, because there's an intervention that says, sometimes we need to open up a bit and see what is happening outside our country, and that politicians need to be exposed to their peers in other countries to learn how things are done elsewhere, to unlock also the transition potential in their own countries, and that this should not happen only in COP-related events. And I know mayors have been really active over the past 2 years in particular to get together, to share their wisdom. If you can say a bit more on how you are doing that as mayor of Haifa, for those very specific headaches you're dealing with on a daily basis, how do you seek inspiration from some of your peers?
Actually, a lot of inspiration. We were, during these couple of years, we were in close contact and in also conferences. And we thank the Zoom, the ability to keep us all connected. And we've seen and we read a lot about the way other cities dealt with the change that we need to have in our cities because of the pandemic and for other reasons as well. So there were many things we've done. I can say that, for example, we took a few streets that were important. We closed them to pedestrians. We scattered around a lot of street furniture. And we see today different use in the public places in the city, a different atmosphere. And I think many of our citizens regained a lot of the public domain of the city. They discovered places that they did not know existed. So we see a very big change in that. I think that is perhaps the major thing that we've done. We also worked a lot with the small businesses and other partners. And our goal was to see the change. And of course, this is something that we saw in many, many places around the world. Bike lanes, for example, this is something that we worked on. We are now working on various plans to add bicycle paths and lanes. And we also discovered, because of the ability to use the Zoom, we also did a lot of public participation events. We didn't think that they will work, but it was incredible to see how people were actually starving to take part in the urban projects. And sometimes we opened events that hundreds of people came to. You know, people were closed, were in lockdowns in houses, and we thought that the urban life cannot stop. We have to continue our work on the city and its development. And this is what we also projected to the citizens of Haifa. We're still here, we're working, and you can be part of it. And thanks to the ability to use digital connection, we saw that many citizens were part of our project, became part of our project. And I think this was all the inspiration of many, many cities.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mayor. Second question, maybe I'll ask this to Areli about security and safety issues related to cycling, because you've been very vocal about the benefits, and some of our participants are flagging, you know, the risks. What are cities doing to contain, you know, those risks related to the security for cycling?
Well, security issues are one of the main barriers, if not the most outstanding barriers for people to really choose cycling as a means of transportation. So it's a key component of making alternatives feasible for most people. So we have an opportunity now that we're entering the second decade of action for road safety. And it's needed to say that in the Mexican context, in our experience, the more people bicycle, the more people is in the street. This helps to reduce all sorts of road crashes. It improves and promotes that people can feel secure on trying, and to gain confidence, and to gain also strength to go and cycle every day. So it's something that as any other major change in our daily lives, like having a new diet or a new exercise dynamic routine, it needs persistence. It needs time to settle. So we really think, and it's very important to outline this, cities and people must persevere if we need and we want these changes to really be part of the solution and provide all the results that it can provide to the city and to the world at large. So it is important to go out there very with maybe prudence, with care, asking the governments to really put in place security and road safety measures, as lowering speed, and to really have a good transit bills and transit bills that can prevent crashes in place, and be able, you know, to share the road and to share the street, and allow this change to settle and to give us all the benefits that it can provide for the city.
Thank you very much, Areli. And a last question, maybe I'll address this one to both Carlos and Karen on the political economy of reform. There are a number of comments saying we've had the evidence for a long time, we have the data, we know the benefits of that transition to clean forms of urban mobility, but still it's not happening, at least at the level and magnitude that it should be happening, even if many agree this crisis was not wasted on that front. So being both very pragmatic, what can be done in addition to the stick and the carrots that you mentioned to accelerate that bicycle revolution? Maybe we start with you, Carlos, and then some European perspective from Karen. I think you're on mute, Carlos.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oui, merci pour cette question. En réalité, la crise que nous vivons aujourd'hui, elle est double. Elle est même triple. Nous avons donc une crise climatique qui, quoi qu'il arrive, on l'a vu avec la COP26, nous oblige à changer nos modes de vie. C'est la première leçon. Plus que nos mobilités, c'est nos modes de vie qui doivent être changés. On peut continuer à changer nos mobilités. On peut continuer à utiliser le vélo, mais si on change nos modes de vie, nos modes de travailler, nos modes de produire et nos modes de consommer, on sera toujours dans l'impasse. Deuxième élément, cette crise donc, est également une crise de santé. La crise de la pandémie est une crise beaucoup plus profonde parce qu'elle nous a entraînés dans notre mode de fonctionnement par rapport au temps dont nous disposons, par rapport au temps utile, par rapport à nos proximités, par rapport à nos quartiers, par rapport à nos ressources. Troisième élément, le modèle économique, et je réponds à la question, également, donc, sont en train de changer en profondeur dans les villes. Pas uniquement dans les hypercentres, mais il y a aussi des changements par rapport aux gens qui habitent un peu plus loin que par rapport à l'hypercentre. Donc, moi, je dis toujours, je l'ai dit à Areli qui fait un travail formidable au Mexique, la question de la mobilité, elle doit être liée non pas uniquement à un mode de déplacement décarboné, il doit être lié à comment nous sommes capables de créer des liens entre nous, à comment nous sommes capables de tisser de la valeur, à comment nous pouvons changer nos modèles de production et nos modèles de consommation. Si on continue à faire des vélos, mais si on continue à acheter par Alibaba ou par Amazon, si on continue à acheter avec des sacs plastiques, si on continue à produire donc de manière déconsidérée et à consommer un peu n'importe quoi, même si on est en vélo toute la journée, eh ben, on sera toujours au même point. Et donc, cette question, Aziza, je réponds en disant, pour changer radicalement, et ça a été dit tout à l'heure par Karen, si nous devons changer radicalement, ce n'est pas être extrémiste, c'est aller à la racine des choses. Et c'est pour ça qu'aujourd'hui, aller à la racine des choses, c'est proposer un autre mode de vivre fondamentalement. C'est pour ça que je considère que la révolution des proximités, avec la ville des quarts d'heure, avec les territoires des demi-heures, est une manière de faire l'écologie de manière différente. Parce que la ville du quart d'heure, quand on marche et quand on est en vélo, on vit différemment. Parce que le travail d'aujourd'hui, je ne suis pas pour les pyjama working, pour travailler chez soi. Je suis pour le travail décentralisé, pour irriguer les quartiers et les lieux, de lieux de travail dans lesquels on vient un quart d'heure à 20 minutes, on est connecté à distance et on passe de quelques heures à quelques jours sans aller de manière obligée aux endroits où nous allions avant tous les jours avec 2-3 heures de transport. Moi, je dis que l'enjeu de la mobilité dans nos villes aujourd'hui, si on va vers cette révolution de la proximité, des proximités au pluriel, c'est quitter la mobilité obligée par la mobilité choisie. Et la mobilité obligée, ce n'est pas uniquement les voitures, ce n'est pas uniquement le métro, c'est également quand on est obligé de faire même une heure en vélo. Donc la mobilité choisie, ça va avec un autre mode de production. Et pour les pays de l'OCDE, c'est se mettre en cause effectivement sur comment on crée de la valeur avec un comportement écologique et un comportement social qui soit à impact positif.
Merci, Carlos. Karen, your quick turnaround on this question, implementation, acceleration.
Yes, indeed. So the evidence is there that we need to radically transform transportation, but at the same time, when we try to introduce indeed interventions that have to do with more sustainable modes, they all call for prove it that it's going to work, or prove it that it's going to improve our cities and not make things worse for me as an individual. And in that sense, it's indeed unfair that we are now facing the legacy of decades of car-based planning, which was not being built on any evidence, but we now are facing the results of it on the one hand, and then on the other hand, that when we want to do something better, we really need to justify that in terms of hard data and quantifying impacts. While this is unfair, we do try to help build evidence for our cities to be able to take on that leadership role and to take sensitive decisions, which are not always politically rewarded. Because the challenge for politicians is always that they need to find a way to reconcile with what the individual citizen wants with what the city as a whole needs, what society as a whole needs. And there we need, of course, to tackle the big crises. So the good thing is that we are living in an increasingly digitalized world, and that there is a lot of potential in terms of capitalizing on that data that is becoming available to build an evidence case and to show that we can move towards evidence-based decision-making also in a way that it favors the sustainable modes that we want to push forward. So that's one thing that I think we should capitalize on, but we also need to build the skills within our cities to handle that data in a smart way and to use it as evidence for taking decisions in favor of sustainability. And the other thing is, coming back to also what the mayor said, is look at other cities and see what works there and also use it as an inspiration. Brussels has recently also announced that it wants to move to zero emission in 2030, 2035 framework. And they asked us, please bring us the examples from Paris, from London, from Amsterdam, so that we can show our citizens that we're not crazy, that we're not alone in doing this, but that we're jointly joining forces across different cities to really tackle the challenges that are ahead of us. And the good news is also that when we come to integrated packages of measures, we can tick several boxes. What is good for climate change is mostly good for air pollution as well. It's usually good for safety too, and also for reducing congestion. So we really can tackle different challenges in one go if we take an integrated approach.
Thank you, Karen, stressing the co-benefits. Maybe expanding on this question back to you, Walid, on some of the recommendations that the OECD is extending to curb sprawl. Is it something for national governments to do? Is it something for local governments to do? Probably both. And what has your research shown so far?
Yes, so let me first say that there's 4 principles for any policy action in this interface, urban development, transport. First, the coherence, the policy coherence, because you know in this interface there's many policy sectors. So you have transport policy, you have housing policy, planning, etc., economic development, energy. So you have the coherence is needed. And the past we saw a lack of coherence that promoting different objective, opposite sometimes objective. Then the effectiveness, so that you should be sure about the result and that this policy can change actually the different side effects, environmental or social. Then the efficiency, because we were talking about public transport. Sometimes you have objection about some extension of metro line or buses, or why? Because we evaluate that not efficient from economic point of view. And here I would like to say, be careful, because when you include the avoided cost of public transport, then this changed the rule. Think about air pollution, for instance. That when you have more people using the mass transit, then you can have this avoided cost, which is important. And finally, to be just, to be inclusive. That's very important. There's 3 vectors that we can use here. And here I would like to echo Professor Carlos about shortening distance, commuting. That's very important, and that's something we have to think about it in the long run when it comes to the urban planning. This is the first point. The second policy vector is support technological changes with the autonomous cars, with electric cars. Think about electric mobility for public transport, for instance. There's many plans around the world about this perspective. Third, promote sharing mobility. That's very important. Then let's share the car, but also share the service. Going soft mobility means that when it's possible, let's make biking available for people and also walking available for people. That's something can be go also through the planning of streets and safety and security, etc. And finally, obviously public transport for all. And let's make the public transport not something that just for suburban area. We understand that now it's the orientation that public transport goes for suburban area, but that's something maybe you have to revise to make public transport high quality, available, frequent, and that's make people more interested on it.
Thank you very much, Walid, for these principles that I think remind us, or let's say re-emphasize the critical role of national urban policies to get that policy coherence. We've seen at the OECD to which extent, you know, thinking transport or housing in silos without necessarily connecting them and developing those policies based on where people actually work and live rather than pure administrative boundaries can be counterproductive. And I think it's been a long-standing message of the organization to tell national governments that they have a critical role to play to get their cities right. And many of the vectors that you emphasized require that shared responsibility across local and national levels, especially in terms of investment. We know in the OECD region, for example, that 40% of public investment that goes to transport is discharged at subnational level. That is really something that emphasizes this needed multi-level governance and policy coherence. Over to you, Areli. Maybe also from the exchanges you've had with your peer bicycle mayors, how you've seen this extra mile in the acceleration of the revolution. What would it take? What do governments need to unlock that potential from your activist standpoint?
I think we need to have better conversations because the results are there or are ready to be seen as it's being shared on the Q&A platform here. We have evidence and the results are there to be seen, but we need to be more quick to make these changes feasible and affordable and positive for many people, especially to decision makers. And I think we have a big role to play as citizens, as organizations. This is so important. We don't have to leave decision makers to do this on their own. We need to be there. We need to be vocal and say, yes, we need cleaner, we need better streets, we need safer streets, and we want to have better spaces for live in our cities. And I think this is a key role that we need to play as citizens. There's not we need to be really clear that every people has a power and we need to use it every day. Not only the way we choose to live, but also the way we choose to gather and to be involved in the public sphere and on the public conversation. So I think this is a revolution, not only on changes on mobility, but on a revolution on how we live our lives in the city, as Dr. Moreno was saying. So we need to, take this in our hands and being able to be vocal and be there and push for these changes and be part of the changes, as Gandhi said, be part of the changes that you want to see in your city.
Thank you very much, Areli. And I'm turning to you, Mayor. You mentioned earlier some initiatives that you're taking to revive a bit your city centers, to make more room for pedestrians. And maybe I'll ask you the question that has come up in the Q&A, which is the role of citizens and NGOs in these sorts of urban measures that are developed at the local level. If you can, you mentioned earlier how you interact with stakeholders at large and including the private sector. If you could say a bit more on how you build that social and political acceptance maybe of those reforms that we know are not always spread evenly in terms of the benefits or costs they generate across different types of urban dwellers. So how do you engage with citizens and NGOs, and where do you see maybe areas where national government support in countries, including Israel, that tend to be highly centralized, would make a difference and help you to accelerate your action?
As I said earlier, we conducted many events with citizens, public participation events, and we did not let the pandemic stop us. And we found out that it was amazing. People really took part, and all stakeholders, everybody, whether it's small businesses, whether it's urban dwellers, whether communities, everybody wanted to take part, and we started communicating also with very small groups of people in order to understand what they need, what they're lacking, and meet their needs. We also, you mentioned the pedestrians and the transportation in general because of the pandemic, and we saw, of course, that there was a very severe problem. People did not want to use public transportation. So two things happened in Haifa. One is like a shuttle of taxi, a big taxi, a small bus of, let's say, 10 people max, and this shuttle stops in the stations, in the bus stations, but you can call with an application by the cellular phone. You can call the small bus or the large taxi, whatever. And during the pandemic, we said that only a few people can use it. So it became an incredible transportation vehicle. Also for people who needed to go to work, but the public transportation stopped. So it was like an amazing option that we did not have before, and it started during the pandemic. The other thing we did is to come up with a plan of escalators, of urban escalators, mechanical. As I said, Haifa is located on a mountain, on a very big slope, very hilly city. And we identified in the city center places that are more important or more central to the people. And we started adding the dots and connecting the dots and indicating where we would like to have these escalators. And now actually we're working on the first or even perhaps two projects. So what we did was planning in the last couple of years, and now we're hoping to start seeing things come to real life. So that's perhaps, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting examples of co-production in a bottom-up fashion, and also place-based responses based on the needs from your urban dwellers. Thank you very much, Mayor. Je vais passer à Carlos peut-être pour la dernière question de ce deuxième tour et en profiter pour dire qu'il nous reste à peu près un quart d'heure. Si vous avez des questions en ligne, n'hésitez pas à les poser et on aura peut-être une fenêtre pour en prendre 2 ou 3 de plus. Carlos, d'abord pour vous donner l'opportunité de développer ce concept de la ville du quart d'heure, et si je puis me permettre aussi peut-être expliquer votre pensée quant à l'aspect inclusion qui est lié à cette ville du quart d'heure, car on a beaucoup discuté, notamment tous les deux, et on voit certaines voix s'élever aussi contre ce qui est perçu comme étant peut-être des risques de fragmentation ou de ségrégation spatiale si on juxtapose des villes du quart d'heure qui sont déconnectées les unes des autres. Je crois que ça n'est pas la philosophie de votre pensée, mais j'aimerais vous donner l'opportunité d'expliquer et de faire le lien entre la ville du quart d'heure et la question des inégalités, dont on sait que c'est une patate chaude pour beaucoup de villes aujourd'hui dans les pays de l'OCDE. Carlos.
Tout à fait. Merci Aziza pour cette question. Et effectivement, la ville du quart d'heure, c'est devenu aujourd'hui un gimmick repris un peu partout dans le monde, mais il faut d'abord partir des fondamentaux. Nous vivons aujourd'hui, depuis 70 ans, dans des villes très segmentées, dans des villes très fragmentées, même dans des villes avec beaucoup de ségrégation urbanistique, économique et sociale. Deux chiffres qui sont extrêmement clairs et un peu partout dans le monde métropolitain. Globalement, autour de 70% de la population active qui est quelque part dans un territoire s'élève à peu près aux mêmes heures, tôt le matin, pour converger par un déplacement vers moins de 10% du territoire. On est en train de toucher cette pendularité qui est un reflet des inégalités que nous sommes en train de vivre parce que tout le monde ne se déplace pas de la même manière. Le bâtiment dans lequel nous avons construit dans les villes, il faut savoir qu'entre 30 et 40% sont ouverts uniquement dans la journée. C'est-à-dire que entre 60 et 70% du temps, des bâtiments qui sont là, qui sont prêts à l'emploi, sont fermés. Nous avons une énorme ségrégation sociale dans les villes parce qu'on a créé une très forte séparation sociale entre des fonctions élémentaires, l'habitat, le travail, la santé, la culture, l'accès à l'éducation. Et donc, c'est parce que nous sommes partis du constat de cette fragmentation que nous avons proposé, en fait, un autre mode de fonctionnement qui repose sur la mixité de ce que nous appelons la circularité sociale. Nous avons identifié, après un long travail de recherche et également de terrain, 6 fonctions sociales qui sont indispensables pour avoir justement une meilleure qualité de vie. Habiter dignement, travailler sans de longs déplacements, autant que possible, accéder à des vrais achats par des circuits courts et pas par Internet, accéder à la santé physique et mentale en suivi de proximité, et on voit avec le Covid, accéder à l'éducation et à la culture également dans une proximité qui facilite donc cela pour tout le monde, et pouvoir se prélasser avec un air pur, de l'air, de la végétalisation. La ville du quart d'heure, en fait, ce n'est pas mes quarts d'heure à moi. La ville du quart d'heure, c'est une ville polycentrique dans laquelle on veut recréer un nouveau mode de vie, dans lequel on vient réaménager notre manière de vivre en faisant donc de la mixité fonctionnelle quelque chose qui ira de pair avec une mixité sociale. C'est également préserver les biens communs. Et les biens communs, c'est très important par rapport à ces villes de proximité au pluriel dans lesquelles les quarts d'heure, c'est les quarts d'heure de tout le monde pour que la ville soit irriguée des services. Le bien commun, c'est considérer par exemple que le commerce et les emplois locaux sont un bien commun. C'est ce qui a fait la ville de Paris, par exemple, qui a une filiale de la ville de Paris à 100%, qui s'appelle la SMEs, qui achète des mètres carrés un peu partout dans la ville pour installer des commerces qui vont faire de l'artisanat, qui vont faire des librairies, qui vont faire des salles d'exposition, qui vont vendre des produits recyclés de deuxième, troisième vie. Des commerces qui n'auraient pas pu exister si ce n'était pas un bien commun, parce que le loyer aurait été très cher. C'est également les sociétés que la ville de Paris a créées, des social housing, pour pouvoir loger les gens dans des quartiers et les sortir des ghettos. C'est également offrir du travail décentralisé pour que tout le monde ne se déplace pas à la même heure à l'autre bout de la ville. C'est également proposer que la culture ne soit pas uniquement dans quelques lieux dans lesquels j'y vais, mais qu'on irrigue les quartiers également de la culture. C'est les centres de santé, pour que la santé puisse venir et être à disposition de tous et chacun par des moyens physiques ou par des moyens technologiques. Vous voyez que, je m'arrête là parce que je serai trop long, mais la ville du quart d'heure, c'est les quarts d'heure de tous et chacun. Écologiquement, ça permet d'irriguer des services auxquels je peux accéder d'abord à pied ou en vélo, mais je peux aller où je veux parce que je ne suis pas dans cette mobilité obligée pour aller 1h30 ou 2h ou 3h dans la journée dans mon lieu de travail à partir de mon lieu d'habitation. C'est donc donner à la vie beaucoup plus d'équilibre écologique, économique et social. Donc la ségrégation sociale, ségrégation urbaine, elle est déjà présente et nous voulons lutter. Par contre, je l'ai dit également, ce n'est pas une baguette magique, ce n'est pas uniquement donc en quelques semaines qu'on va changer 70 ans d'urbanisme moderne fragmenté. C'est pour ça qu'il faudra une feuille de route portée par une gouvernance locale qui donc prend les sujets, travailler avec également le secteur privé, notamment pour que l'emploi se décentralise, et aujourd'hui on peut le faire avec les Covid, et impliquer les citoyens avec l'urbanisme tactique, l'urbanisme temporaire, et également donc changer la culture citoyenne. 3 choses pour finir. Il faut changer les rythmes de vie dans la ville. Tant que les rythmes sont les mêmes, nous aurons des villes qui seront donc inégalitaires. 2, mieux utiliser toutes les ressources que nous avons près de chez nous, un lieu, plusieurs usages, et chaque usage de nouveau possible. On gagnera beaucoup de temps, d'efficacité et on pourra mieux implanter des fonctions économiques et sociales dans les proximités. Et 3, il faut changer la culture urbaine. Nous savons que c'est le plus difficile, parce que pour beaucoup de gens, c'est plus facile d'aller en voiture à l'autre bout de la ville que c'est dire qu'on va être en proximité, qu'on va dire bonjour aux voisins, qu'on va faire ses achats, non pas par Internet, mais en allant donc dans les marchés à côté, parce que ça va recréer de l'emploi, ça va recréer de l'activité. Chrono-urbanisme pour le rythme des vies. Chronotopie pour que les lieux soient d'usage multiple, et topophilie pour qu'on soit capable d'aimer les lieux dans lesquels on vit, sortir de l'estress et sortir de l'anonymat. C'est ça les ingrédients avec les biens communs que nous proposons pour une ville de proximité heureuse, bien loin des caricatures des villes ségrégatives, puisque nous nous battons pour une ville d'inclusion sociale avec des nouveaux modèles économiques qui créent de l'emploi et qui créent de la richesse.
Thank you very much, Carlos Moreno. I think indeed reminding that segregation is already a major issue in many cities. Actually, data we have produced at the OECD shows that in large cities like London or Baltimore, you can have a 20-year difference in terms of life expectancy based on your zip code or where you actually live. And I think what you emphasized, and I couldn't subscribe more to that in terms of the need to revisit our relationship to time, and in particular how the digital revolution and the teleworking revolution may accelerate that rethinking so that people no longer do the same thing at the same time in the same place, such as agglomerating in crowded transportations to get to the office at 9 a.m. And the flip side of the coin, which is rethinking infrastructure in a way that they can have multiple uses at different moments of the time, whether it's a school or a bar or a restaurant, and knowing also that only 30%, of the time those buildings are usually used in cities like Paris is probably a good way to minimize the pressure on land, minimize the pressure on public services, and maybe strike a better work-life balance. And that addresses also a question that was asked about citizens' relationship to well-being and how we need to rethink what economists called agglomeration benefits based on the spatial concentration of firms and workers, which could be rethought in light of the benefits of agglomeration that come from revisiting our relationship to time. So thank you for that, extremely insightful. Maybe we have 5 minutes left. I'll give you just 1 minute or two max, Karen. I would like to hand over to you that question that was asked on the chat about technology, and I think that goes to the discussion around the smart city. There's a perception that sometimes come with the identification of the problem and the technological response to the problem, and some are better, let's say, more vocal about what types of technologies we need to solve specific problems. And I know you've been doing some thinking also about smart city reshaping and transitioning from this tech-centered smart city into something that is a bit more people-centered. If you can take us through your thinking about tech, digital in particular, and the city of tomorrow in a minute or two, and then we'll close.
Okay. Thank you. For me, a smart city is not a city that is filled with technology. I mean, innovation can also be innovation in the way we shape our policies, innovation in the way we involve our citizens and co-create policies, etc. So the fear of missing out, I think, is never the right reason for a city to introduce a new solution, whether it's automation, whether it's micromobility, whether it's mass or electrification. That's why I strongly believe in the governance of innovation. There is a solution coming from the private sector, from a commercial player, which wants to make a profit. Fair enough. That's because, I mean, it's part of their existence, and that's okay. And then there is the public policy goals that cities have. And the goals of the private sector and of certain commercial solutions are not necessarily aligned with public policy goals. And that's why the governance of innovation is so instrumental, that cities put the regulatory frameworks in place that make sure that the innovations they want to embrace are also helping to contribute to reaching their policy goals. And in some cases, that might mean that they decide not to engage with a certain innovation because it's not a solution to a problem they are facing. And this will be instrumental in going forward, this public governance of new technologies, not in engaging for the sake of it, but looking at whether they are part of a solution that we want to reach, and then also setting the rules of the game. For automation, it might lead to more kilometers driven if we just replace existing cars with automated cars. For electrification, we need it to be multimodal or we will have clean congestion. For mobility as a service, we have to make sure that public governance secures that those modes that are the most sustainable are being prioritized and not the ones that generate the most revenue. We already see the monetization of walking happening, for example, where people are being nudged onto an e-scooter if they're asking for a walking route on Google Maps. That's not the kind of model shift we're looking for. And I can continue with plenty of examples that show the instrumental role for the governance of innovation in moving forward and in becoming a truly smart city.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karen. Technology as a means to an end rather than an end per se, and the governance framework for it to get it right from the onset. This takes us to the end of the session. I would like to thank all our speakers for your time, your generosity. Karen from Police Secretary General, Carlos Moreno from University of La Sorbonne, Mayor Einat from Haifa, and Areli, bicycle mayor from Mexico, and my colleague Walid OUESLATI here at the OECD, senior economist in the Environment Directorate. I think we've seen clearly how this pandemic has been a catalyst for change, a sort of magnifier, a trend accelerator. We've seen to which extent transport and urban design go together, but are only part of the solution. And many of the sessions that will come later these days in the forum will connect the dots and bring other perspectives, other solutions for rethinking that built environment and cities of tomorrow. All the presentations will be made available online since the question was asked, the recordings as well. And let me also thank the interpreters. Sorry if we've been speaking a bit fast. I hope you didn't struggle too much, and all the participants for your time and the quality of your questions. Thank you all very much. A big round of applause that you may or not hear from the room. And with this, we are closing this first thematic session of the forum. Thank you all.